Good evening, everyone. I am Jason Unruhe, and welcome to my podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be going into the real meat and potatoes of the origins of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the real veal Orloff casserole of inter-imperialist warfare. The narrative being spun by both sides is oversimplified and, frankly, dishonest. They both refuse to take some serious historical nuance and basic facts about the global order today. Now, this is something that I've wanted to discuss at length for some time, but have never really had the time to actually go into, given the whole university thing and dealing with making the other regular videos, because things always just come up and then your attention gets dragged away, etc., etc. Like one of the things I'm working on right now is a video about Andrew Tate and much of the ideology that he espouses. But today is about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the main problem here is that neither side in this conflict is actually being genuine in any way, shape, or form. What we have is, despite the adamant denial of just about everyone on both sides, insisting that this is, it's either Russia bad or America bad, and essentially didn't do anything wrong on both sides, depending on which side you are. Obviously, nothing in real life is actually that simple. And to believe otherwise is to either be mindlessly worshiping Putin because you're a racist, homophobic, xenophobe, or you're just riding with Biden because you basically don't have any intellectual integrity. So I am not going to just give this complete nonsense position that either NATO did nothing wrong or Russia did nothing wrong, because that is so devoid of any material reality. It's laughable that any Marxist would even take that position to begin with. So, having said that, let us begin. So, for 2 years now, Russia and Ukraine have been locked into a war. Now, this war, in my view, and I think mine is correct, this really isn't a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is essentially a war between the United States and Russia. That's merely using Ukraine as the proxy or the stand-in for the United States. Both Russia and the United States are imperialist. There's basically no denying it at this point. And the reason that I shouldn't have to explain why the United States is imperialist. I think that's pretty simple. That's pretty straightforward. The export of capital, the continuous bombing and murdering of the entire world for, monopoly capital, energy profits, petrodollar, and all that. But Russia, if you think for a second that Russia has any altruistic purpose or any altruistic goals here, is just simply nonsense. Putin is not a socialist. And anybody who happens to think that Putin is a socialist or that Russia is socialist needs to proceed directly to Gulag. Do not pass go. Do not collect universal health care, etc. It's literally a capitalist country by capitalists, run by a capitalist, all in the name of making profit. But you have some nationalist rhetoric, so a bunch of tanky kids think that automatically means it's socialist. That is very, very far from the truth. Russia is capitalist. It's imperialist. It's literally doing imperialism right now. It's literally going to try to take what they can, depending on how the war turns out, in order to benefit Russia. But to be more specific in this case, this conflict only exists because we are in a multipolar world, and a lot of so-called Marxists are cheering this along with the ginger weasel Moppin and Midwestern Marks, etc., who suddenly think that a multipolar world means that, oh, now is a great time for my really far-right version of Marxism that's completely devoid of any materialism to step forward and try to step up and take over the narrative. Well, taking over the narrative, they certainly are. And who would have actually thought that a rightist, basically a fascist in disguise movement and ideology would take off in the first world in a time of crisis? It's not like myself and the Leading Light Communist Organization predicted that this would happen like 10 years ago. Oh, yeah, we did. In times of crisis, the advanced industrialized nations do not tend towards revolution. They tend towards fascism, and that has repeatedly happened throughout history. But for some reason, these poor American patriots who are trying to call themselves Marxists, they think that somehow they're special and unique, and this isn't going to happen to them, even though they're the ones that are actually doing it. It's another further projection of the manifest destiny, the America is somehow special and unique in the world, and their whole completely fascist nationalist rhetoric trying to pass itself off. So it's the same, American exceptionalism. So we do have these two imperialist powers, and they are fighting over the future of Ukraine. Let's be perfectly honest about where all of this started. For a very long time, before the Pat Sox discovered what politics is, and when most of them were, like, frankly, literally children, Ukraine basically had a Russia-friendly, if not puppet, government that served Russian interests. And it was there for a considerable amount of time. And then you had the uprisings. There was social unrest, and the United States jumped in and funded frankly, a Nazi overthrow of the government. And the United States admitted they were doing that. They said that they supported the people doing it, even though they were neo-Nazis. They literally went ahead and changed the law so that they could send war materials, or essentially economic and material support to neo-Nazis in the country to overthrow it. The Azov Battalion, the Right Sector, all of those people. So eventually, with enough backing and the instability of Ukraine at the time, what happens? It gets overthrown, as was very probably going to happen, considering how unstable the country actually was. So for a time, there was literally a Nazi government. But of course, since the U.S. was pulling the strings, they were the ones who decided who would actually be the leader. And they put Zelensky in. That was eventually their choice. They picked a comedian, because that's who you would want running a country, someone with, what is basically no political experience whatsoever, running an entire country, which is not really all that bad of a choice, considering he doesn't really make many decisions on them by himself. He's told to do what the United States does. So what we have is basically a color revolution against a Russian, essentially a Russian-controlled leader, disposed, and then place entirely a U.S.-backed puppet in its place. Meanwhile, there's no democracy for the Ukrainian people in either way. They haven't been exercising any self-determination. Both Russia and the United States have completely robbed them of that to a significant degree, and that's been going on for decades. This is not anything new. It's just the United States having their puppet running the country is a new thing. So now we have a power struggle between the United States and Russia. Now, Russia knows what's happening, and anybody who's bothering to really pay attention knows that this is happening as well. So Russia's not going to stand for it, especially in this modern era where the United States is essentially, for all intents and purposes, collapsing in on itself due to the contradictions of its own system, its financial instability, the continued weakening of the petrodollar through the actions of the countries that are choosing to rise against it, notably Russia and China, those two particular enemies of the United States. So, being that, frankly, the other powers in the world smell blood, Russia decides, you know what? I think we're going to go take it back. So they began funding, efforts to undermine, etc., to essentially get Zelensky removed and replaced with another Russian puppet, so that the U.S. puppet is out and the Russian puppet is in. And they're going along, and the United States, out of fear that this would essentially happen, that it would be overthrown and that Russia would take it, they decided to go ahead and make Ukraine a NATO country. That way, if you invade the Ukraine, which wasn't actually the plan by Russia, there was no plan to actually invade the country at all, would then bring down the hammer of the entire NATO organization. Well, let's be honest, basically just the United States, because every other country in NATO is frankly fed up with dealing with this and wouldn't have actually gone to war with Russia because they wouldn't have actually won. So what does all this actually really amount to? Well, it amounts to the United States violating its agreement with Russia not to place a NATO country on its border. Now, obviously, Germany doesn't count because after the wall was sabotaged, Germany reunited, and obviously that's going to be a NATO country on its border. That was just kind of inevitable. That wasn't going to happen any other way. They agreed not to expand any more NATO countries on its border. So the U.S. does what it always does, completely violate all of its agreements, and does it. Oh, we're gonna put Ukraine in NATO so that anything you do to them, we now have the legal right to do something back. Well, of course, this would place a major military power, which that's what's going to happen next, is Ukraine's going to be flooded with U.S. Army personnel with other weapons, and if not, some of the most sophisticated weapons in the world aimed at Russia. So we decide, you know what, we're actually not going to risk this, and invaded. They violated their agreement. So Russia said, if you're going to violate yours, we're going to violate ours. It goes ahead and invades. That's kind of really the crux of all this. None of it actually had to happen. None of the misery right now was necessary. All of this could have been avoided if the United States had simply not broken its agreement. If the two of them just sat there like the imperialist swine that they are and just kept trying to overthrow each other's backed men running the country, then history would have probably marched on the way it usually does. But that's not what the United States wanted. They wanted to make it so that they could be authorized to use military force against Russia and essentially decimate the country if it decides to essentially defend itself. The U.S. knows that it's collapsing, and it knows that Russia's rising. It knows that China's rising, and they're going to put a military power on its border. Now, why would an empire tolerate having another empire with guns directly on its border pointing at them, especially when they're not supposed to be there to begin with because there is an agreement? And despite what has been said by essentially every NATO-aligned organization, that there actually was an agreement. I know they like to say that there was no such thing and it was a he said, she said thing, which is really funny because Russia had mentioned that several times in the decades since the end of the Soviet Union, and at no time did the United States decide, hey, we should probably correct them on that because it's not true. Well, they didn't correct them on it because it was true, which is why if you Google that specific fact, you find nothing that violates or even questions the mainstream narrative. Now, the mainstream narrative isn't always wrong. It isn't always right. But on something as very unique and specific as this, and there's nothing there, something that you know is a very real, like mainstream issue. It's not like someone denying vaccines or something. And there's no basically hearing the other side on something that is big and global as this. And that is of an actual political, geopolitical situation. You got to start asking questions. And besides, are we supposed to really believe the United States just wouldn't violate its agreements? I mean, this is the country that lies to go to war constantly. So, Russia's not going to sit there and just have a NATO ally right on its border aiming guns at them. So they said, well, to hell with this. If they're going to threaten us by putting these military forces here and expanding their military alliance into a place that they said they weren't going to, then to hell with it. They got together, they got their military together and invaded. And that is basically how this started. Neither side is the good guy because none of them are being altruistic. None of them are there because they care anything about the Ukrainian people. Let's face it, Zelensky doesn't care about his own people. The United States doesn't care about the Ukrainian people, and Russia, frankly, doesn't care about the Ukrainian people. So it's really the Ukrainian people that are getting screwed in all of this. So Russia invades, the war begins, and eventually, Donbass and the break-off republics who hadn't broken off yet eventually do get Ukraine forced out of it. And being that they are a majority ethnic Russian area, like in the upwards of the higher 90s or at least mid 90s% of the population, they choose to say, hey, we should break off because one, we don't want to be ruled by essentially the Nazis that are running Ukraine. Not like, oh my God, everybody's a Nazi. No, like literal Nazi, like actual swastika waving, ethnic cleansing kind of Nazis. And being that they are already ethnically Russian, choosing to go over to the side of Russia is pretty much a no-brainer. So they didn't actually join. They broke off and formed their own republics and then proceeded to call themselves socialist republics. Although where the socialism was in all of that, I don't know because I really didn't see any. But in fairness, there wouldn't have been any direct, immediate transformation into socialism anyway. Even if that really had been the goal, that would have been asking too much of them at the time. Even now, it would be asking too much to them. They're not the same thing as the global powers who have moved to socialism. But that was never really the point. Now, I do believe people like Russell Bentley legitimately wanted those goals, Eastern Orthodox God or Russian Orthodox God, whichever one he believed in. I believe it was the Russian Orthodox God. Rest his soul. And the terrible situation surrounding his death. I believed him to be genuine. I don't believe Putin to be genuine. Or the Russian government, for that matter. So eventually they break off, form their own republics, which they do have the right to do because the people there in the country wanted to and voted to, and it's fixed, it's not real, Putin manipulated it, etc. And I'll believe Putin fixed it when somebody shows me some evidence of that actually happening. But there has been no evidence whatsoever that these were rigged elections, etc. And it's perfectly reasonable that a 95 some odd % ethnic Russian population would vote to leave Ukraine. And essentially those two states work together. And then they began a process of joining with Russia, and that hasn't turned out. Frankly, in my opinion, I don't think that they are. I don't think they're going to join Russia. I mean, it would be great if they stayed completely independent and went socialist, but let's be honest, they're not going to go socialist. Russia isn't going to let that happen. Even if that's really, really the goal. Those two countries are going to remain separate from Russia, and I believe in order to put a buffer between what's left of the rest of Ukraine and Russia. So what I think is probably going to happen is that, well, Ukraine has essentially already lost the war. They don't have any ammunition left. The U.S. doesn't have any ammunition to give them. They don't have any artillery shells. And there was even a picture posted recently by the U.S. Army where they were using Korean artillery shells, the South Korean artillery, I believe tank rounds or artillery shells. I can't remember offhand because they don't have any of their own left. Their manufacturing of it has not kept pace with the amount of consumption that has been going on with the conflict. Not that they've had, like 2 years to get it together to do that. So essentially, Ukraine is going to lose. It's only a matter of time now because they don't have the resources. They have to basically kidnap people off the streets to make them fight. And then they had the the women's rights minister say that, oh, we should start drafting women into the army to make things more equal between men and women. I think a lot of people suddenly came out against equal drafting at that point from all sides, because a lot of Ukrainians don't want to fight this war because they know they're going to lose, which is why so many of them have been fleeing the country in the millions, and most of them going to Russia, despite what the mainstream media is telling you, that information is out there, that they have been going to Russia and Russia's been taking them in, because their fight really isn't with the Ukrainian people, it's with the US-backed government. So really what we could probably expect to happen, and what I think is definitely going to happen, is it's going to reach a point where Ukraine simply cannot fight anymore, and it's just going to get steamrolled by the Russian military. And then it's going to come down to essentially probably Zelensky fleeing the country and going to the United States. And then a deal is going to be offered to Putin, offered to Russia. You can keep the break-off provinces, but stop your march towards Kiev, and we can end this right then and there. To which I believe largely Russia will agree to. Because I think that in the end, that's what it is that they really want, is to not have a NATO ally on its border. A NATO country on its borders. And the two break-off republics would make a nice buffer between the two of them. So they'll probably ask for another agreement for NATO not to expand into Ukraine. So they'll ask for that, and for the two break-off states to stay where they are. And they'll probably get it. It would be, if we have to continue through this whole god-awful nightmare of a war, would be the simplest, easiest solution to the entire situation, and could practically end it within a few days. But that's probably what I believe is going to happen by the end of this conflict. That's what this is all going to turn into in the end. Maybe Zelensky gets overthrown and replaced with a Russian puppet. Who knows? But I think at the very least, that's basically what's going to happen. And I think that's a pretty fair analysis. I think that's a pretty fair, reasonable thing to expect, geopolitically, and with, very simple common sense, simple analysis that neither side, neither the pro-Putin tanky kids on the internet want to hear, and it's not what the NATO simps want to hear. They only want to hear, essentially, didn't do nothing wrong from whatever their particular side is. This, of course, is a completely ahistorical stance. It completely ignores material conditions. It completely ignores how geopolitics is actually accomplished. What they're really just doing is essentially mindless propaganda. It's not even good propaganda where you're telling the truth and you're telling it in a way that supports your position, because that's what propaganda is, just producing a viewpoint. It can be true or not. It's actually very bad propaganda because it's very poorly done. It's clearly done with absolutely no ability to convince anybody of anything, which, God bless the tanky kids, they're trying, to which I would say that the NATO simps aren't even trying. So there is the comparison that you can draw there. You see, when people do this, people want to pick sides in inter-imperialist conflict. Okay, go ahead. You're going to do it anyway. It really doesn't matter. My problem with it is when so-called Marxists are doing it. Because, well, frankly, taking sides in an inter-imperialist conflict, or they like to justify it by calling it multipolarism, is, well, it's bullshit. This is not a Marxist position in any way, shape, or form. This is completely violates, even the most basic tenets of basically anti-imperialism, which, it's, kind of right in Lenin's writings, not to do this. It says not to take sides in an imperialist conflict. Nowhere does Lenin say, yeah, completely simp for one of the capitalist sides, so that way we write. No. Actually, what Lenin does say in his works on it, A Caricature of Marxism and Imperialist Economism, he says, but this Kievsky argument is wrong. Imperialism is as much our mortal enemy as capitalism. That is so. No Marxist will forget, however, that capitalism is progressive compared with feudalism, and that imperialism is progressive compared to the pre-monopoly capitalism. Hence, it is not every struggle against imperialism that we should support. We will not support the struggle of a reactionary class against imperialism. We will not support the uprising of the reactionary classes against imperialism and capitalism. He lays it out pretty straight right there. Now, the sad part is, not only are they not listening to this, where Lenin spells it out very specifically, it shouldn't take an actual Lenin quote for people to understand that, for these so-called Marxists to understand that. They should be able to maybe not necessarily figure out, because most of them, God help them, are barely out of puberty. You shouldn't have to actually quote Lenin. You should be able to just give them the rational argument as to why they're wrong and let them accept that. But see, they don't. They don't listen to any rational argument. They don't do any theory, which is why you never see them ever posting anything about theory. You don't see them discussing any geopolitical anything. Everything is just straight up mindless simping for Russia. So it's almost like an appeal to authority fallacy, that this is not what anti-imperialism is because Lenin said so. It shouldn't actually have to get to that point. It should be plainly obvious not to support one capitalist over another, but they're not going to do that. They're going to do it anyway. And this is, frankly, a major point of contention, and why they are not Marxists. Because they are just going ahead and supporting a capitalist power while pretending that they're Marxists. And what's really, really god-awful about this is the amount of mindless support for anything Putin does. A pat sock or a, whatever you would call nationalism around a cult of personality. This is a goddamn cult of personality around Putin. That's what these kids are doing. And that's literally their level of theoretical understanding. Some of them, they're adamant, look at me, I read Lenin, I read this theory. No, you haven't. One, you haven't actually been a Marxist long enough to have actually read it. Two, you didn't even know this quote even existed. And three, you haven't even been a Marxist long enough to even grasp some of the most basic concepts like the market and private ownership of capital, which is why you think Russia's socialist and you think China's socialist. I mean, it's just, it's frankly ridiculous. They don't know what they're talking about. Not at all. So let's get into the real heart of why it is that they support Putin and this quote unquote multipolarism. They're homophobes. they're transphobe homophobes. Because if you press them on anything about this and you really push them onto why they support it, they eventually come down to, it always comes down to, they're against the Western liberal degeneracy. Okay? Could you please define what Western liberal degeneracy is? And if you keep pressing them, they eventually just admit it's an anti-gay, anti-trans stance. I mean, this is literally just talk to them, and this is going to come out sooner or later. They're literally just homophobes. They're just against this quote-unquote Western liberal degeneracy because they don't like gays, and they think it's some kind of plot by the, well, ask a bunch of them, and they'll probably give you a different answer. A lot of them tend to, actually this actually being the reason for it. I mean, for some reason, this is like the main thing for them, not like the fight against capital or anti-imperialism, because it's a really horrible thing. It really comes down to just anti-gay, because that's all that really matters to these people. That's what it is. I mean, look at Maupin. All he cares about is Americana, which is built on a gigantic lie, the largest mountain of genocide that there is in human history. The entire concept of America, right from its very root to the furthest stem, to the furthest leaf, is nothing but fascism, which is appropriate given that he is a fascist himself. It's just so blatantly obvious. You claim to be a Marxist, yet you're clearly supporting a capitalist in Russia, in Putin. And then when pressed why you do it, you end up talking about Western liberal degeneracy. Okay? So you're a Marxist, but you're pushing conspiracy theories about Western liberal degeneracy coming for your kids and transgender whatnot, groomers and whatnot. And then, doing all of this while supporting what is essentially capitalist government. Yeah, there's a term for that. Fascism. Being that it is completely devoid of any Marxism. And as I've said, that's what it really comes down to. And that's what they are eventually going to have to acknowledge, what this is really all about for them. If they weren't claiming to be Marxists, I wouldn't care. Then they could go do whatever you want. Go say whatever you want. We know you're a fascist because that's what you're doing. The problem is that they're running around claiming to be Marxists when they don't know a single thing. Nothing. Not one of them has ever been able to make any sense whatsoever. Most of them just point to Caleb Maupin trying to successfully taking a Marxist quote out of context and manipulating it in a way that he wants it to say, which is why he never tells you the part before it or the part after it, which would discredit everything that he was saying, because he's frankly a dishonest piece of shit. So that right there is basically it. That is what we are actually looking at when we see all of this complete bloody nonsense. When it comes to trying to view this whole situation between Russia and Ukraine, it's two imperialist powers going at it, with the Ukrainian people in the middle just getting pounded into the dirt by essentially their own forces, their own government, the terrible poverty that's increasing, and then getting pounded by the Russian forces at the same time. What's really sad about this is that none of it had to happen. Nobody's hands are clean, except the Ukrainian, the general Ukrainian population, except for the ones in the military that are committing horrendous war crimes. That's not to say that the Russians aren't committing war crimes too. It's why it's called a war crime, because it happens during war. But all of this whole situation was set off by the United States trying to make Ukraine a NATO country, because the two imperialist powers are competing with each other. Russia doesn't want them to expand any closer to them, and why would they? And Russia wants to expand its influence beyond its borders. It's sure as hell not going to get Africa, because China has pretty much snatched all of that up and exported their capital there, proving that they are imperialist. And it's so sad, because all this suffering is for nothing. Like, this isn't going to accomplish anything in any way, shape, or form. It was completely meaningless. And that's what's really bad about this. So, looking at all this, I can see that time is just about up for today, but that should basically give you the gist of everything that has been going on with, not what going on with this war, but what led to this war, what created it. It would be a whole other thing to explain everything that has been going on in this conflict. But to put it simply, this is an explanation as to why it happened. So maybe in the future, United States, actually keep your word. I mean, we know that you're lying, psychotic monsters, with the whole lying about every conflict, the so-called incubator babies for the justification for Desert Storm, and the weapons of mass destruction to justify the Iraq War, Gulf of Tonkin, etc. So nobody should believe you. I mean, at this point, Gorbachev should never have ever actually believed the United States when they said they wouldn't put, that they would agree not to put a NATO country on their border. So that is going to do it for this podcast. I do want to thank you for listening. Sorry, I'm used to doing videos, not podcasts. And if you do want to continue to support the work that I do, I would highly encourage you to go to my Patreon in the description and maybe set up a donation. Like I said, all I ask for is everybody who watches regularly to donate $1 per month. You're going to lose more than that in your couch cushions during that time. It's not very much. But again, these are free, and they will continue to remain free, and sending money is optional. I'm not going to give you some sad sob story about how I need the money or anything. So again, that'll do it for this episode. I do thank you for listening, and I will be back next week with another video, with another podcast discussing another issue fully in depth. That's a lot easier to do in this medium rather than doing it as a whole YouTube video, which at this length would take an insane amount of time to actually record. So once again, thank you for watching.